You smell it before the coffin is opened. Not perfume, not incense, but death, wet silk, rotting flesh, and something worse. Movement, something stirring beneath the skin. She had once been draped in gold, crowned beside a king. Now, her skin sloughed in folds, and her wounds, long sealed by linen, had become hatching grounds. One priest vomited, another whispered, "There are worms, and they are alive. You do not speak. You are here to bear witness to the final hours of Isabella of Valois, Queen of England, a child bride, a widow before her womb ever bore fruit. Her flesh would become its own tomb. And when they lifted the veil, there were things crawling beneath it. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and what you're about to remember may never leave you again. If what you're about to witness leaves you unsettled or awakened, consider subscribing. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but to let these buried voices rise again. Leave a like if her story lingers. Leave silence if it hurts too much to speak. Every grave hides a tale, and some, like hers, refuse to stay quiet. And this is what history smells like when the veil is lifted. She was born beneath the stained glass ceilings of Louvre Palace on November 9th, 1389, a child of Valois blood, descended from kings, betrothed by treaties. Isabella of France, later called Isabella of Valois, was not born to choose. She was born to seal peace. And at 6 years old, she was crowned Queen of England. You remember her face from the paintings. Pale, somber, almost porcelain. But what they never painted was the smell that filled the abbey when her coffin arrived, or the decay that crept beneath her ribs before she even turned 30. They never painted the worms. At the heart of this story is not just a queen. It is a kingdom divided, a marriage forged by war, and a body that, despite all divine titles, rotted like any other. Her union to Richard II, 22 years her senior, was a political armistice. She crossed the English Channel at the age of 7, too small to ride her own horse, too terrified to understand the language of her new husband. She never became a lover. She became a widow at 11. When Richard was deposed and later murdered, likely starved or bludgeoned in captivity, Isabella was stranded in a foreign court, refused her dowry, and denied her return. She was confined in Windsor Castle like a valuable prisoner, a bride with no groom and a title with no power. Eventually, she returned to France and was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orléans, but her body never recovered. Court physicians reported she suffered from prolonged weakness, swelling of the abdomen, and unexplained fevers. Some blamed grief. Others suspected pregnancy gone wrong. But none could stop the infection. What began as pain in her side became a spreading rot beneath the skin. Treatments were crude, leeches, blistering poultices, bloodletting, and only hastened the deterioration. She faded quickly, died in September of 1409. She was not yet 20. But what made her death truly grotesque came after. In the cool stone crypt of the Celestine Monastery in Paris, the royal body was wrapped in ceremonial silks and left in vigil. By the time the clergy returned the next morning, the wrappings had ruptured, the flesh had broken, and from the lacerated wounds, larvae had begun to emerge. The monks tried to hide it, but it was recorded. Whispers passed from servant to servant. The queen is being eaten. And now, so are you, eaten alive by a history that tried to silence her ending. The child crowned in the throne of grief. You were there the morning the ships docked at Dover. The wind off the English Channel whipped through the banners. But even the cold couldn't touch the silence. No cheers, no crowds, just nobles and soldiers, staring at a figure so small she could barely see over the railing of the vessel. She was 8 years old, but her face had been trained not to show it. Isabella of Valois stepped onto English soil not as a child, but as a treaty, an offering from the Valois crown to the Plantagenets. meant to bring peace after generations of bloodshed. Her father, Charles VI of France, had signed the Truce of Lullingham with Richard II of England. A fragile ceasefire in the 100 Years' War, and the price of that peace was her body. She wore white, embroidered with fleur-de-lis. Her hands trembled as she curtsied to the husband she did not choose, a man 22 years her senior. Towering over her, bearded and weary from years of war and betrayal, Richard was 30 years old. She was a girl who still played with dolls. The marriage was ceremonial, no consummation, no bridal chamber, just politics wrapped in silk and prayers. And yet, in the chronicles, Richard is recorded as doting, calling her his little queen, swearing to protect her, holding court with her seated beside him on a tiny throne made especially for her frame. For a while, she smiled, she adapted, she grew, but shadows fell quickly over that fragile peace. Less than 2 years after the wedding, Richard was overthrown in a bloodless coup by Henry Bolingbroke, who seized the crown as Henry IV, Isabella's protector. Her symbolic father was suddenly declared a tyrant, imprisoned, and, though the records are murky, likely murdered by starvation or bludgeoning while held at Pontefract Castle in 1400. They never told Isabella. They said her husband was alive and well, just exiled. But she stopped smiling that winter, and she stopped speaking by spring. At 11 years old, she was no longer queen. She was a political liability. Henry IV offered to marry her to his son, the young Henry of Monmouth, later Henry V. She refused, or perhaps her family did. Either way, the proposal was rejected, and Isabella, royalty by birth and title, became a prisoner in Windsor Castle. Held in gilded rooms, surrounded by foreign maids and watchful guards. They say she rarely ate. She sat for hours staring at the gardens. Sometimes, she would whisper in French to herself. No one answered. Isabella's only lifeline was her ladies-in-waiting, French-born companions who risked punishment to sing her lullabies from childhood. But one by one, they were dismissed, replaced by English women. Even her dolls were taken. 3 years passed. Her body matured, but her eyes remained hollow. The little queen became a ghost in silk, trapped in a country that no longer wanted her but dared not return her. Eventually, in 1401, under immense pressure from France and the Pope, Isabella was released and returned to Paris. But nothing remained of the girl who had left. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, was preoccupied with the madness of King Charles VI, who believed he was made of glass and sometimes forgot he was king at all. Isabella, once the daughter of promise, became a burden. She was married again, this time to Charles, Duke of Orléans, her cousin. He was only 11 at the time, she was 16. The union was political, meant to unite factions within the French court. But Isabella was no longer the girl who danced at coronations. She was tired, sick, and though the couple eventually found gentleness in each other, their time was brief. In late 1408, Isabella became pregnant. Chroniclers say she experienced severe pain early into the pregnancy, possibly a miscarriage, possibly an ectopic complication. Doctors were summoned, but medicine in the Valois court was still rooted in bloodletting, herbal fumigations, and the application of warm pigeon blood to the stomach, a remedy believed to draw out the illness. But Isabella did not get better. Her fever worsened, her abdomen swelled, and the skin along her flanks began to darken, stretch, and crack. What was spoken behind curtains is only found in hints. A monk who prepared her chamber for anointing recorded a smell of sweet oil turned bitter. A maid confessed she saw movement beneath her linens, and a physician wrote only, "Her body cannot be touched. The flesh rises to resist the hand." She died on September 13, 1409, in the royal household at Blois. No official cause of death was published. Her body was placed in state at the Celestine Monastery in Paris. clothed in ceremonial silks and sealed in a wooden casket lined with lead. But the embalming was rushed. The heat of the late summer lingered in the chapel vaults. By the second night, a terrible odor spread through the nave. Candles were lit to mask it. Doors closed. But the morning brought what no one could ignore. The cloth around her abdomen had ruptured. The wound beneath had opened. And from the exposed skin, larvae had emerged, white, writhing, and alive. The attending priest tried to conceal it. But the rumor spread. The queen is feeding worms. It reached the market by sundown. And you, standing among the mourners, choking on the scent, you remember it still. Because a queen was supposed to rise to heaven in glory, not melt in linen while vermin fed on her womb. The wound that preceded the worms. They called it a simple inflammation. That was the phrase used in the royal ledger, written in the spidery hand of a court scribe. The queen experiences a swelling of the side, accompanied by weakness and melancholy. Physicians note a simple inflammation. But what emerged from beneath her skin, days after her death, told another story, a festering, internal rupture that no one dared name. Not aloud, not in ink. You remember the room where it began. The palace at Valois was quieter than most royal residences. Its long halls echoed with more prayer than laughter. Isabella had spent the summer there in retreat from Paris, recovering from the exhaustion of pregnancy, or, some whispered, from a slow-burning illness that had never quite left her since England. She was 19, already twice married, already widowed once, already forgotten. The physicians came and went, muttering contradictions. One blamed miscarriage, another, womb fever. But the truth, in that time, had no name, and if it did, it was too shameful to speak over a queen's body. What we know now, what modern medicine might suspect, is some combination of puerperal sepsis, peritonitis, or abdominal gangrene, all of which were fatal in the 15th century, all of which end the same way, the body turning against itself. Blood thickening with bacteria, and tissue blackening beneath the skin until it rots before the breath stops. The first sign was the swelling. At first, it was mistaken for the belly of pregnancy. But it grew uneven. The skin began to redden, then darken, then split, and the smell, it arrived before the fever broke. Chroniclers did not describe it in medical terms. They used poetry to distance themselves. A sweetness turned sour. The air grew yellow in her chamber. When one approached, it felt as if the body repelled touch. She was bathed in rosewater. Perfumes were poured at her feet. Linen wraps were changed daily, sometimes hourly, but nothing stemmed the infection. The rot was beneath, and it was hungry. What few records survive say that in the final 2 days, she could no longer move. Her speech failed. Her hands curled in upon themselves. Her eyes opened but did not track motion. The Archbishop of Sens arrived to offer final prayers. He noted her skin as unsettled, a term never explained. Behind closed doors, attendants described something else. The skin along her left side had burst open. A viscous discharge, black-green in color, seeped onto the bedsheets. One chambermaid fainted. Another ran barefoot through the stone corridors, screaming for vinegar and fire. When she died, her mouth was open, but no sound escaped. Just breath, foul, warm, and fleeting. Death did not end the damage. It released it. The embalming ritual began within 12 hours. At the Celestine Monastery in Paris, monks gathered to prepare the body for viewing. But already, her abdomen had begun to bloat, and the priests in attendance argued over whether to cut or compress. In that time, embalming was a brutal process. It involved removing the viscera, stomach, intestines, uterus, then stuffing the cavities with herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender. But Isabella's condition was advanced. When the body was opened, the organs had liquefied, and the abdominal wall was weakened. A decision was made to bind her with wax-sealed linen. Instead of cutting further, it was a shortcut, a mistake. The casket was set upon a stone pedestal in the main chapel. A vigil was held, candles burned, psalms were sung, and then the veil was lifted. 2 days later, what happened next is recorded in one of the monastery's marginal notes, a small red-inked comment beside a prayer for purity. Found worms crawling beneath the linen of Her Majesty. Along the side previously afflicted, movement was visible. Several larvae emerged. The cloth was replaced in haste. Room was sanctified. No one spoke again. Another monk wrote simply, "God tests us with what crawls beneath the skin." Word of the incident was suppressed. But the royal laundress, tasked with removing and burning the soiled linens, shared what she saw before her silence was bought. The flesh had burst. The wound was alive. I saw it. It blinked. Historians today remain divided. Some argue the worms were already present, laid by flies before burial. Others suggest the infection itself had created a moist, open cavity that attracted vermin. But what none deny is this: the wound was real, the rupture was visible, and it moved. In medieval Europe, bodily decay was not just a medical failure, it was a spiritual judgment. To rot before burial was seen as divine punishment, as if the soul had left in disgust. But Isabella was not evil. She was not cruel. She had harmed no one. She was a child used as a token in war, a widow before she was a woman, a prisoner in one kingdom, a pawn in another. Her only crime was being born royal, and bearing the weight of other men's ambitions. And still, she decayed. Still, her body broke. Still, the worms came. You stood in that chapel. You held the cloth. You saw what moved beneath. And you did not speak. Because sometimes, to tell the truth about a queen is to betray the illusion of royalty itself. The coffin that would not hold her. It was never meant to leak. The coffin was sealed in haste. A lead lining had been hammered into the wood, standard for royals. Meant to preserve dignity in death, to hold in the scent, the fluids, the failure of the flesh. But Isabella of Valois had already betrayed the illusion of preservation. Her body had broken from within, and now it was breaking the box. You were there when they carried her through the nave. The monks held their incense too close to their faces. The air was thick with lavender smoke, but it could not disguise the odor. Not entirely. One nobleman whispered it was like meat left to rot in rain. Another said nothing, just pressed a perfumed kerchief to his mouth and refused to look at the casket. They laid her in the center of the chapel, between 2 altar candles nearly as tall as a man. Beneath the vaults of the Celestine monastery, Isabella's coffin was meant to remain in solemn stillness until her interment at the Abbey of St. Laumer. But silence could not hold what the lead could not seal. The first sign came from the floor, a damp spot, no larger than a coin. At first, they thought it was spilled holy water, but it darkened, spread, stained the stone. By dawn, it was clear. Something was seeping. The monks gathered in secret. They lifted the veil, peeled back the lower cloth, and there it was. A slow, thick drip, not blood, something darker, oily, smelling of salt and sickness. Cadaveric fluid. The decision was made quickly. No public viewing, no second vigil, no delay. She would be buried immediately. But nothing was ever immediate in the death of a queen. The procession to St. Laumer took 2 days. They traveled by cart, covered the coffin in banners and gold-threaded cloth. But even in the open air, the smell followed. It clung to the horses. It soaked into the wood. And in the back of the cart, the leak spread. By the time they arrived, the cloth at the base of the coffin was soaked through. The guards refused to carry it without gloves. One slipped and dropped his corner, drawing the attention of the crowd. The chroniclers left out this moment, but the priest who led the final rites did not. He wrote, "I feared the queen would come apart in our hands. The box groaned when we laid her down, and where the wood joined, I saw a bead form. It wept. At the gravesite, the coffin was not lowered with reverence. It was slid, edged, tilted, and still, it dripped. There is no record of what prayers were said, only that the funeral was abbreviated, only that the crowd dispersed early. And that night, according to an apothecary's apprentice who was sent to bless the site, a wild dog was found sniffing the grave mound. It had dug down to the wood. They beat it off with torches. But even the dog could sense what the court would not admit. The queen had not been buried. She had been hidden. In death, Isabella was not honored. She was managed. She was not remembered. She was contained. And even that failed. Because the story did not end with the burial. In the weeks that followed, rumors spread throughout Paris, not about her illness, not about her marriage, but about her body, about what had been seen when the cloth came loose, about what had dripped from the coffin, about what the dog had unearthed. Some claimed she had been poisoned. Others whispered she bore a child who died with her. The most persistent rumor, that she had been buried alive, and the worms were her last companions, was not true. But it spoke to the horror that surrounded her death. And horror never stays buried. Isabella's tomb was unmarked for years. The original plans for a marble effigy were never completed. The wars with England resumed. France sank into chaos. Her husband, Charles of Orléans, was captured at Agincourt and held in England for 25 years. No one spoke her name at court. No masses were commissioned for her soul. But in the monastery, among the monks who had wrapped her body, it was said, "She will return." Because rot is never silent. And perhaps she did, because in the following decade, 5 separate monks at Celestine reported dreams of a young woman in white, with one side of her dress soaked and crawling. In each dream, she asked the same thing. "Have you sewn me shut this time?" Of course, these were dismissed. Of course, they were forgotten. But you were there when the coffin wept. You saw the drop form. You heard it land. And you remember what it smelled like. Because that smell is the truth. And it cannot be embalmed. Not with flowers. Not with saints. Not with time. The royal body and the lie of immortality. You had been told that royalty does not rot. That kings and queens die in perfumed dignity. Their bodies washed in rose oil, wrapped in velvet, and entombed before the flesh dares change. That holiness protects them. That lineage makes the blood too noble to spoil. That even in death, they remain untouched. But then came Isabella, and the worms, and the dripping box, and the silence. History books write of her beauty, of her delicate manners, of how she endured exile and remarriage. But they never write of how her belly burst, how monks found maggots in her linen, how the body of a queen, anointed by bishops, married to kings, and born of empire, became a thing to hide. Because the body is not loyal to myth. The lie of royal immortality begins with image. You remember the portraits, ivory skin, gilded crown, eyes cast upward. But those paintings are not bones. They are brushstroke lies, meant to reassure the living. Isabella's real body told a different story. A girl sold into marriage at age 7. A widow at 11. A second bride at 16. A corpse before 20. The pressure placed upon her small frame, ceremonial, sexual, political, was too much for any spine to bear. Her collapse was not sudden. It was planned, designed, forged by the same machinery that kept crowns polished while wombs bled unseen. In medieval Europe, royal women were vessels for treaties, for heirs, for reputation. Their physical decay was an embarrassment, a failure of the sacred order. And so when Isabella ruptured, when her skin turned, when her wound opened, when the coffin wept, her body was betrayed again. Not buried in state, not honored in sculpture, but hidden, quieted, forgotten. There is no preserved tombstone of her at Blois, no glowing monument in marble, No litany of mourning songs preserved in the royal annals. Only faint records, only side notes, only the stain she left. The clergy tried to reassert order. They conducted rites, sealed the chapel, burned the linens, scrubbed the stone. But the rumor spread faster than the smoke. And the truth was worse than heresy. Because Isabella proved that not even the blood of France could resist decay. That a queen's body could burst. That divine right had no power over gangrene. That flesh, no matter how blue its blood, still rots when abandoned. You remember the chambermaid who screamed when she saw the rupture. You remember the priest who dropped the vial of chrism when the smell reached him. You remember the candle that flickered out, not from wind, but from the damp in the air. You remember the silence after. No one spoke of her again, because to speak of her was to speak of the failure of immortality. Centuries later, when bones were exhumed from the crypts for relocation, no royal seal was found on her casket. Only scraps of cloth, only rot-stained lead, and yet, she remained, in rumor, in dreams, in the whispered fears of queens yet to die. One French chronicler, writing in the 1450s, noted in his diary after visiting Blois, "There was a queen who died here, but they say she was not whole when she passed, that she was opened from within, that her beauty wept out of her." He did not name her. He did not need to, because by then, Isabella had become a parable, a warning. That beauty does not last. That power does not preserve. That even the smallest girl, if forgotten, can rot into myth. And now you, centuries removed, are left to remember what the court chose to erase. You are standing not in a palace, but in a monastery. You are not before a throne, but before a leaking coffin. And the image that haunts you most is not her crown, but the moment her linen moved. Because in that twitch, in that slow crawl beneath the cloth, you saw the collapse of everything you were told about royalty. You saw that even queens decay. And that is the truth they never want remembered. The linen that moved, you saw it. You stood in that chapel when the incense failed, when the velvet veil shifted, when the light from the high windows caught something moving, just beneath the linen, near the wound that would not close. You did not scream, you did not speak, because you understood something that the others did not. She had not been forgotten. She had been buried in silence. And silence does not preserve the dead. Isabella of Valois was born into a lie, a world that promised her holiness for wearing a crown, immortality for obeying the court, and peace in exchange for her body. She gave all three, and in return, she received none. She died younger than most peasants, her womb empty, her legacy sealed in wood and damp cloth, and her body, soft, bloated, ruptured, became the most honest account of her life. Not the paintings, not the ceremonies, but the rot, the worms, the weeping box. And now you remember her, not in glory, but in truth, because for all the monuments raised to kings, it is the stories buried with queens that rot the hardest and whisper the longest. When the linen moved, so did the illusion. That royalty meant protection. That beauty could not bleed. That a girl's body, offered in marriage for peace, would be honored in return. Instead, it was opened, and it was fed upon, and it was hidden. But memory, when carried in silence, is stronger than stone. Isabella's name is not sung in royal halls, but it is spoken here, because her wound became her voice, because her decay became her testament, because the linen that moved has not stopped moving. And now, you have seen it, too. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness, and that is enough to keep her from vanishing forever.